Little girl draws the man who scammed her millionaire dad. What he discovers next changes everything. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and type Amen in the comments. A beautiful piece of good news may come your way very soon, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. The marble floors of Matthews Corporation gleamed under the afternoon sun, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched 30 stories above downtown Chicago. William "Bill" Matthews sat at the head of his mahogany conference table, his jaw clenched as he reviewed the devastating financial reports spread before him like evidence of his own professional execution. $300 million gone. Vanished into thin air by a man he'd trusted with his company's future, his employees' livelihoods, and his family's legacy. The mahogany table, a gift from his late father when Bill had first taken over the company 15 years ago, now felt like a witness to his failure. Around it sat 12 of Chicago's most respected business minds, their faces grave as they absorbed the magnitude of the catastrophe that had befallen Matthews Corporation. "Sir, the board is demanding answers," his assistant Margaret whispered, sliding another document across the polished surface. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of worry. She'd been with the company for 8 years, had watched it grow from a modest construction firm into one of the Midwest's premier real estate development giants. "The shareholders are in panic mode. Some are calling for your resignation." Bill's weathered hands, calloused from his early days, swinging hammers and pouring concrete before he learned to pour foundations for financial empires, trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. The ceramic mug, emblazoned with "World's Best Dad," a Father's Day gift from Grace 2 years ago, felt heavy in his grip. At 45, he'd built Matthews Corporation from a small construction company his father had left him into one of Chicago's most successful real estate development firms. He'd survived the 2008 recession, the pandemic, countless market downturns, and competitive challenges. Now, in a matter of weeks, it was all crumbling like a building with a faulty foundation. "Tell them I'll have answers soon," he said, his voice hoarse from countless sleepless nights spent poring over contracts, bank statements, and legal documents, searching for some clue he'd missed, some red flag he should have seen. David Morrison promised revolutionary green technology. The patents, the prototypes, the environmental impact studies, everything seemed legitimate. His credentials were impeccable. The irony wasn't lost on him. Morrison had presented himself as a champion of sustainable development, promising technology that would revolutionize eco-friendly construction. Bill had been so eager to position Matthews Corporation as an industry leader in environmental responsibility that he'd perhaps been less cautious than usual. The technology would have allowed them to build carbon-neutral skyscrapers, homes that generated more energy than they consumed, developments that actually improved the local ecosystem rather than depleting it. Richard Clearwater, the company's chief financial officer and Bill's oldest friend, cleared his throat. The forensic accountants found the money trail goes cold in the Cayman Islands. Morrison was thorough. He knew exactly how to make $300 million disappear without a trace. "What about the FBI investigation?" asked Jennifer Wu, head of legal affairs. Her normally pristine suit showed signs of the stress they'd all been under. Coffee stains, wrinkled fabric, the toll of working 18-hour days trying to salvage what they could. "Agent Rodriguez says they're making progress, but Morrison covered his tracks well," Margaret replied, consulting her tablet. "Multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, falsified documents. This wasn't the work of an amateur." The conference room door burst open with a cheerful bang that cut through the oppressive atmosphere like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. 7-year-old Grace Matthews bounced in, her golden pigtails flying behind her like silk ribbons, completely oblivious to the tension filling the room like thick smoke. She wore her favorite dress, the blue one with tiny yellow flowers that her grandmother had bought her for her birthday last month. and her shoes made soft clicking sounds on the marble floor. In her small hands, she clutched a piece of construction paper covered in colorful crayon marks, the kind of artwork that typically adorned refrigerators and proud parents' office walls across America. "Daddy! Daddy! Look what I drew!" she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings with the pure joy that only children possess. Her eyes sparkled with the excitement of an artist unveiling her masterpiece. The silence in the conference room was deafening, as if Grace's arrival had sucked all the air from the space. 12 powerful executives accustomed to making decisions worth millions of dollars suddenly found themselves frozen by the presence of one small child. Bill set down his coffee cup with a deliberate calmness that belied the storm brewing inside him. The same careful control he'd learned during his early days negotiating with hard-nosed contractors and demanding clients. Grace stood there in the doorway, completely unaware that her innocent interruption had just paused a corporate crisis meeting. The afternoon light streaming through the windows behind her created an almost ethereal glow around her small figure, making her appear like an angel sent to deliver unexpected news. Margaret started to rise from her chair, her protective instincts toward both Bill and his daughter kicking in. She'd helped raise Grace in many ways, babysitting during late meetings, helping with school pickups when Bill was traveling, but Bill held up his hand, a gesture that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. "Not now, sweetheart," Bill said gently, though his heart ached seeing her innocent excitement dimmed by his distraction. The guilt of being an overwhelmed single father in the midst of a business crisis weighed heavily on his shoulders. Since Grace's mother had died in a car accident 3 years ago, he'd struggled to balance being the father she needed with being the CEO his company required. "Daddy's in a very important meeting with all these people." Grace's lower lip jutted out in that determined expression Bill knew all too well. The same look she got when she was insisting on wearing her princess dress to the grocery store or demanding ice cream for breakfast. It was an expression that told him she had something important to say and wouldn't be easily dismissed. "But Daddy, it's really, really important," she insisted, bouncing slightly on her toes the way she did when she was excited about something. "I drew the mean man who made you sad, the one who talks funny in the hallway when he thinks nobody's listening." Every person in the room froze, as if someone had pressed a cosmic pause button. Bill's coffee cup halted halfway to his lips, steam still rising from the dark liquid. Margaret's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Richard Clearwater's hand froze over his tablet. Jennifer Wu looked up sharply from the legal documents she'd been reviewing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications of Grace's words sank in. In her innocent, matter-of-fact way, she'd just suggested that she had observed something that could be crucial to understanding the fraud that had nearly destroyed their company. "What mean man, sweetheart?" Bill asked, his voice carefully controlled, despite the fact that his pulse had suddenly doubled. He gestured for Grace to come closer, his paternal instincts warring with his business acumen. Part of him wanted to protect her from the adult world of corporate fraud and betrayal, while another part recognized that she might have just provided the breakthrough they desperately needed. Grace skipped forward with the carefree movement of childhood, her drawing fluttering in her small hands like a flag of hope. The sound of her shoes on the marble floor seemed amplified in the suddenly attentive silence of the conference room. "The man with the scary voice," she said, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "He was talking to someone on his phone yesterday when I was going to Mrs. Henderson's office for my reading lesson. You know, the lady who helps me with the big words?" Margaret leaned forward, her pen poised over her notepad with the intensity of a court reporter. The other executives exchanged meaningful glances, their earlier despair beginning to transform into something that might have been hope. This 7-year-old might have just provided the first real lead they'd had in weeks. Bill's mind raced back to yesterday's events. David Morrison had been in this very building for their final contract review meeting, the meeting where Bill had signed over the last installment of the $300 million, the meeting that had sealed the fate of Matthews Corporation and hundreds of employees who depended on the company for their livelihoods. He said something about, Grace scrunched up her face in concentration, the way she did when trying to remember her multiplication tables or the spelling of a particularly challenging word. About making Daddy lose lots and lots of money. And he laughed, Daddy. But it wasn't a happy laugh like when we watch funny movies together. It was the kind of laugh that makes your tummy feel funny and scared. Bill's hands clenched into fists under the table, his knuckles white with tension as he processed his daughter's words. The David Morrison he thought he knew, the charming entrepreneur with revolutionary green technology, the man who spoke passionately about creating a sustainable future for the next generation, had been in this building yesterday, apparently celebrating the financial destruction of the very company that had trusted him. The irony was bitter. Morrison had talked extensively about wanting to create a better world for children like Grace and his own daughter Sophie. He'd shown Bill pictures of Sophie during their first meeting, gushing about how 7-year-olds saw the world with such clarity and honesty. Now Bill was learning that another 7-year-old's clarity and honesty might be the key to exposing Morrison's deception. "Can you show me your drawing, Princess?" Bill asked, extending his hands toward his daughter with the same gentle patience he'd used when teaching her to ride a bike or helping her sound out difficult words in her bedtime stories. Grace beamed with the pure joy of a child whose artwork was being given the attention she felt it deserved. She handed over the construction paper with the solemnity of someone presenting important evidence, which Bill was beginning to realize might be exactly what she was doing. "I remembered what he looked like because he wears those funny glasses that change colors," Grace said, pointing to her own nose with the simple observation of a child who notices what stands out. "And he always touches that bump on his face when he talks." Bill's world tilted on its axis as he looked down at the drawing. Created with the bold simplicity of childhood art, it showed a stick figure with distinctive oversized glasses drawn in purple crayon, the transition lenses Morrison always wore. Grace had also drawn a dark mark on the figure's cheek, representing the raised mole Morrison habitually touched when nervous, a tic Bill had noticed but never consciously registered. But it was the detail Grace had added that made Bill's blood run cold and his hands start to shake. Morrison was holding a phone to his ear, and coming from his mouth were jagged lines representing words. In a child's shaky but determined handwriting, Grace had written what she'd heard. "He won't ever find out what hit him." The words seemed to burn into Bill's retinas as he stared at the drawing. Here was evidence, created by his innocent daughter, that David Morrison had been actively plotting against Matthews Corporation, even as he sat in this very conference room, shaking hands and signing contracts. Richard Clearwater leaned over to look at the drawing, his face paling as he recognized the subject. "My God, Bill, that's definitely Morrison. Grace got his transition glasses exactly right. I always wondered why they seemed to change colors." "Grace," Bill said, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to maintain his composure in front of his daughter. "What else did the man say? Can you remember any other words?" The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Every executive leaned forward slightly, as if Grace were about to deliver a corporate presentation worth millions of dollars, which, in a way, she was. Grace climbed onto her father's lap, settling comfortably, as if she were simply sharing her day at school rather than potentially providing evidence in a multi-million-dollar fraud case. Her small body felt warm and solid against him, a reminder of what truly mattered in life beyond corporate profits and losses. "Well," Grace began, swinging her legs and making her patent leather shoes tap against the chair in a rhythm that somehow seemed to break the tension in the room. He was walking really fast through the hallway, like when I'm late for school and Mrs. Patterson gives me that look. Grace paused in her narrative, tilting her head the way she did when she was trying to remember something important, like the order of her bedtime routine or the words to a song she'd learned at school. The adults around the conference table waited with bated breath, hanging on every word from this unlikely witness to corporate espionage. He kept looking around like he was scared someone would see him, Grace continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when telling stories about her day at school or recounting the plot of her favorite movies. Like when I take cookies from the kitchen when I'm not supposed to, and I have to make sure Mrs. Henderson doesn't catch me. Bill felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak as he listened to his daughter. Her innocent observations, filtered through the lens of a 7-year-old's understanding of the world, were painting a picture of David Morrison that was completely at odds with the confident businessman Bill thought he knew. "What else did you hear, sweetheart?" Bill prompted gently, stroking her golden hair, the way he had when she was tiny and afraid of thunderstorms. "He said—" Grace paused, her brow furrowing in concentration as she tried to recall the exact words. "He said, 'My wife doesn't have much time left.'" And his voice got all shaky and sad, like when you told me about Mommy going to heaven. Now, the room erupted in quiet murmurs as the executives processed this new information. Margaret was frantically taking notes, her pen moving across the paper with rapid precision. Robert Chen, the head of security who had joined the meeting via video conference from his car, was already reaching for his phone to begin making calls. Bill felt his anger toward Morrison wavering slightly. The mention of a sick wife added a complicated dimension to what had seemed like a straightforward case of corporate fraud. But he couldn't let sympathy cloud his judgment, not when his company's survival was at stake. "And then he said something about Sophie being scared," Grace added, her voice dropping to the whisper she used when sharing secrets or talking about things that made her feel worried. "Sophie?" Bill prompted, though something cold was settling in his stomach like ice water. During their business meetings, Morrison had mentioned his daughter Sophie several times, always with obvious pride and affection. The little girl was the same age as Grace, and Morrison had even suggested arranging a playdate between the two children. Grace nodded seriously. "He said Sophie keeps asking why Mommy cries all the time. And she wants to know if Mommy is going to die like the fish we had that got sick." The comparison, delivered with a child's stark honesty, hit Bill like a physical blow. He thought about his own experience with loss, how he'd struggled to explain Grace's mother's death in terms a 4-year-old could understand. The idea of another father facing that same impossible conversation made his chest tighten with unwanted empathy. And then Grace's voice dropped to an even quieter whisper, as if she somehow understood the gravity of what she was sharing. He said, "They promised they'd hurt Sarah if I don't do this. They said they'd make sure Sophie watches her mother die, knowing I could have saved her." The conference room fell into complete silence. Bill felt the world shift beneath him as the implications of Grace's words sank in. Morrison had mentioned his wife Sarah during their initial meetings, how she was battling cancer, how the experimental treatment was their last hope. Bill had even sent flowers to the hospital when Morrison had to miss a meeting for her chemotherapy session, a gesture that now seemed tragically ironic. Jennifer Wu was the first to break the silence. "If Morrison is being coerced, if his family is being threatened, then this changes everything about our legal strategy." Richard Clearwater nodded grimly. "It would explain why the money trail goes cold so quickly, if he's being forced to hand over the funds to someone else." "Grace, this is very important," Bill said, cupping his daughter's face gently in his hands, the way he did when he needed her full attention for something serious, like explaining why she couldn't run into the street or why she had to hold his hand in parking lots. "Did you see who he was talking to on the phone? Was there anyone else with him?" Grace shook her head, her pigtails swaying with the movement. "No, but he sounded really scared, Daddy. Like when I have nightmares about monsters and you come to check on me and turn on the nightlight." The comparison between Morrison's fear and a child's nightmare struck Bill with unexpected force. He thought about all the nights he'd rushed to Grace's room, finding her trembling under her covers, afraid of imaginary monsters lurking in the darkness. Now it seemed that David Morrison was facing very real monsters, ones that threatened his family's life and forced him to become something he'd never wanted to be. Robert Chen's voice crackled through the video conference speaker, breaking the contemplative silence. "Mr. Matthews, if this Morrison fellow was being coerced by organized crime or corporate extortionists, then we're not just dealing with simple fraud. This could be part of a larger operation, targeting multiple companies." "Then he's not our enemy," Bill said slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. For weeks he'd focused all his anger and energy on David Morrison, imagining him as a calculating predator who had deliberately targeted Matthews Corporation. "He's another victim." Margaret looked up from her notes, her pen poised in midair. "So what do you want to do? The police have been investigating Morrison for weeks, but they've hit dead ends. If he covered his tracks well, it's because he had professional help or professional threats." Grace squirmed in Bill's lap, growing restless with the adult conversation she couldn't fully understand. "Daddy, can I go play with my dolls now? My drawing helped, right?" Bill hugged his daughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Yes, Princess. Your drawing helped more than you know. Mrs. Henderson is waiting for you in the playroom." After Grace skipped out of the conference room, with the same cheerful energy she'd brought into it, Bill stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Chicago. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cityscape, and somewhere out there, a man was being forced to destroy other families to save his own. The city that had given Bill so many opportunities, where he'd built his fortune and raised his daughter, was also home to people desperate enough to threaten innocent families. "We're going to find David Morrison," Bill announced, turning back to face the room full of expectant faces, "and we're going to help him." The room fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of surprise rather than despair. Several executives exchanged glances, clearly questioning whether their CEO had lost his mind under the stress of the company's near collapse. Richard Clearwater was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "Bill, I understand the instinct for compassion, but this man cost us $300 million. Even if he was coerced, the damage to the company is catastrophic. The board will never approve using company resources to help him." "I'm not talking about using company resources," Bill replied, his voice carrying the same determination that had built Matthews Corporation from a small construction firm into a major player in Chicago's development scene. "I'm talking about doing what's right. Morrison has a 7-year-old daughter who's watching her mother die. Grace's drawing didn't just give us evidence, it gave us perspective." Jennifer Wu cleared her throat. "From a legal standpoint, if we can prove Morrison was acting under duress, it could help us recover the stolen funds. Coercion is a valid defense, but it also means the real criminals are still out there." "Exactly," Bill said, his mind already racing ahead to the possibilities. "If we can help Morrison, he might be willing to testify against whoever forced him into this. We could recover our money and prevent this from happening to other companies." Margaret consulted her tablet, scrolling through the notes she'd been taking throughout the meeting. "Sir, what about the media attention? If word gets out that you're helping the man who defrauded the company, the shareholders might revolt completely." Bill considered this, knowing she was right. The business press had already been circling like vultures, waiting for Matthews Corporation to collapse completely. The story of a CEO helping his company's apparent destroyer would either be seen as an act of extraordinary compassion or devastating naivety. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't the same as doing the profitable thing," Bill said finally. "My daughter's drawing reminded me that there are more important things than stock prices and quarterly reports. There's a little girl out there who needs her father to be a hero, not a criminal." The next morning brought the kind of crisp October day that made Chicago beautiful, despite its reputation for harsh weather. Bill sat in his home office while Grace played with her dolls in the adjoining family room, her cheerful chatter providing a soundtrack of normalcy to his increasingly surreal situation. Sunlight streamed through the windows of their Lincoln Park mansion, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The house felt too big sometimes, especially since Grace's mother had died. 2,500 square feet of marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and carefully curated artwork that had once seemed like symbols of success now sometimes felt like an elegant mausoleum. But this morning, with Grace's laughter echoing through the rooms and the promise of answers finally within reach, the house felt alive again. Robert Chen knocked on the doorframe, his expression grave despite the beautiful day unfolding outside. He carried a manila folder that seemed to weigh more than its paper contents should, as if it contained the accumulated weight of human suffering and desperation. "Bill, you need to see this," Chen said, his voice carrying the tone he reserved for delivering the worst possible news. Chen spread the contents of the folder across Bill's mahogany desk like a detective laying out evidence at a crime scene. Inside were photographs, phone records, medical documents, and financial statements that painted a devastating picture of a family's desperate fight against impossible odds. Sarah Morrison, 39 years old, aggressive lymphoma, Chen began, his voice clinical despite the personal tragedy the words represented. "She's been receiving standard chemotherapy at Northwestern Memorial, but her insurance was denied for the newer immunotherapy treatment. The targeted therapy that could dramatically improve her prognosis costs $150,000 per round, and she needs at least 4 rounds. Bill studied the photographs with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a car accident. Sarah Morrison was a beautiful woman, or had been before cancer had ravaged her features. Her dark hair was gone, replaced by colorful scarves that couldn't quite hide the gauntness of her face. In one photo, she was sitting in a hospital bed with a little girl who looked remarkably similar to Grace. The same age, the same bright smile, though Sophie Morrison's eyes held a sadness no 7-year-old should ever know. The medical records told a story of mounting desperation. Insurance denials, appeals rejected, experimental treatments that offered hope but came with price tags that could bankrupt most families. Bill's own experience with medical bills during his wife's final days came flooding back. The feeling of helplessness when money became the barrier between love and loss. "And the threats?" Bill asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be worse than he imagined. "They're real, and they're specific," Chen replied, pulling out another set of documents. "We traced the calls back to a shell company, owned by Nathaniel Voss. The threats weren't just general intimidation. They included detailed knowledge of Sophie's school schedule, Sarah's treatment times, even the route Morrison takes to work every day." Bill's blood turned to ice at the mention of Nathaniel Voss. The name was whispered in the darkest corners of Chicago's business world, a man who specialized in problem-solving for corporate rivals who weren't too particular about methods. Voss operated in the gray areas where legitimate business met organized crime, offering services that left no fingerprints but destroyed lives with surgical precision. "Morrison owes Voss money from a previous investment gone wrong," Chen continued, consulting his notes. a tech startup that Morrison invested his family's savings in 3 years ago. When the company collapsed, Morrison was left holding debt that Voss had acquired through a complex web of financial instruments. When Morrison couldn't pay, Voss offered him a deal: steal from Matthews Corporation, or watch his wife die and his daughter become an orphan. From the family room came the sound of Grace's laughter as she acted out an elaborate story with her dolls, her voice rising and falling with the drama of childhood imagination. Bill looked through the doorway and saw his daughter completely safe and protected in their comfortable world, surrounded by toys and security and the unwavering certainty that her father would always keep her safe. The contrast with Sophie Morrison's reality was heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. "There's more," Chen said quietly, his voice dropping to the tone he used when delivering information that would change everything. "Morrison never intended to keep the money. We found evidence that he's been funneling it directly to Voss, minus only what he needed for Sarah's immediate treatment. He's not getting rich off this bill. He's not even breaking even. He's trading his integrity and his freedom for a few extra months with his wife and a chance to see his daughter grow up with at least one parent." Bill leaned back in his leather chair, processing the information that completely reframed everything he thought he knew about David Morrison. The man wasn't a calculating criminal seeking easy money. He was a desperate father, trapped in an impossible situation, forced to choose between his moral code and his family's survival. It was the same choice Bill would face if Grace were dying and someone threatened her life, and he knew with absolute certainty what choice he would make. "Where is Morrison now?" Bill asked, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "That's the problem," Chen replied grimly. "He's disappeared. Took Sarah and Sophie from the hospital 3 days ago. We think Voss's people might have moved them to a secure location, either for protection or to ensure Morrison's continued cooperation." Bill stood and walked to the window, watching a neighbor's children play in their yard with the carefree abandon that childhood should always include. Their laughter carried on the crisp autumn air, innocent and joyful, and completely unaware of the darkness that could lurk just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Somewhere in Chicago, another little girl wasn't playing in a safe backyard. She was probably sitting in a cold room somewhere, watching her mother waste away while her father sacrificed everything he believed in to buy them a little more time together. "Get me a meeting with Detective Sarah Walsh," Bill said finally, his voice carrying the same determination that had built an empire from nothing. "And prepare a full dossier on Nathaniel Voss. If Morrison is being coerced, then Voss is our real target. It's time to stop hunting the victim and start hunting the predator." 3 days later, Bill found himself in an unlikely setting, the sterile conference room of Chicago PD's Financial Crimes Division, where fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the coffee was stronger than necessary. Detective Sarah Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, spread crime scene photos and evidence files across the metal table, while Grace's drawing sat prominently in the center, like a child's masterpiece displayed at a high-stakes gallery opening. The drawing looked almost surreal in this environment, surrounded by mugshots, financial records, and surveillance photographs. Grace's innocent artwork, with its bright crayon colors and shaky handwriting, seemed to glow against the institutional gray of the police station, a reminder that sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected sources. "Your daughter might have just cracked the biggest fraud case we've seen this year," Detective Walsh said, her voice tinged with amazement as she gestured toward the drawing. "This matches Morrison perfectly, and her testimony about what she overheard gives us probable cause to investigate Nathaniel Voss. We've been trying to build a case against Voss for 3 years. Bill shifted in his uncomfortable metal chair, still grappling with the surreal nature of the situation. A week ago, he'd been a successful CEO, worried about quarterly reports and board meetings. Now he was sitting in a police station, planning an operation based on his 7-year-old daughter's artistic observations. "What's our next step?" Bill asked, leaning forward with the intensity he usually reserved for crucial business negotiations. "We've been watching Voss for months, but he's slippery as an eel," Detective Walsh replied, spreading out surveillance photos of a well-dressed man in his 50s with silver hair and cold eyes. "He never gets his hands dirty directly, always works through intermediaries and shell companies. However, your daughter's drawing and testimony, combined with the phone records your security team found, might be enough to get a warrant." The door opened with a soft knock, and Robert Chen entered with a grim expression that immediately commanded attention. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of urgency, and he carried himself with the tension of someone bearing critical news. "Bill, we found them," Chen announced without preamble. The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Detective Walsh looked up sharply, her hand automatically moving toward her radio. The atmosphere in the room shifted from planning to immediate action. "Morrison?" Bill asked, his heart rate accelerating. "All three of them. They're in a warehouse in Little Village, about 15 minutes from here," Chen replied, consulting his tablet. "Our surveillance team spotted Morrison bringing medical equipment inside around dawn." "Sarah Morrison is. She's in bad shape, Bill, worse than the medical records suggested." Detective Walsh was already reaching for her radio, her training taking over. "This could be our chance. If we can get Morrison to cooperate, we can bring down Voss and his entire operation. But we need to move fast. If Voss realizes we found them, they could disappear again." Bill stood, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "I want to talk to Morrison first, before you move in." "Absolutely not," Detective Walsh said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "This is a police matter now. These people could be armed, desperate. Morrison might not react well to seeing the man whose company he destroyed." "Morrison isn't a hardened criminal," Bill argued, drawing on his years of reading people in business negotiations. "He's a terrified father who's been backed into a corner by circumstances beyond his control. If armed police show up, he might do something desperate to protect his family. But if I approach him as another father who understands what he's going through, he might listen." Chen nodded slowly, his security background giving him insight into human psychology under pressure. "Bill's right. Morrison trusted him enough to do business together initially. That relationship might be our best asset. Trust is hard to build and harder to rebuild, but it's not impossible." Detective Walsh studied Bill for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Her experience told her to follow protocol, but her instincts suggested that conventional approaches might not work in this unconventional situation. "You'd be willing to risk that?" she asked finally. "After what he did to your company? After the financial damage and the threat to your employees' livelihoods?" Bill thought about Grace's drawing, about the sadness in Sophie Morrison's eyes in those hospital photos, about a man forced to choose between his integrity and his family's life. He thought about his own experience as a father, the lengths he would go to protect Grace, the moral compromises he might make if her life hung in the balance. "He didn't steal from me," Bill said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of newfound understanding. "He was forced to steal from me. There's a difference between a predator and a victim, even when the victim is forced to cause harm." 2 hours later, Bill stood outside a nondescript warehouse in Little Village, wearing a wire and accompanied by plainclothes officers positioned strategically around the building like chess pieces on an urban board. The neighborhood was industrial, all concrete and steel and the smell of machinery, but through a grimy window he could see movement inside that reminded him that real people with real fears were trapped within those walls. The weight of the wire felt strange against his chest, a reminder that this conversation would be recorded, analyzed, potentially used in court proceedings that could determine the fate of multiple families. He raised his hand and knocked on the steel door, his heart pounding with the rhythm of a man about to change everything. "David," he called out, his voice echoing slightly off the warehouse walls. "It's Bill Matthews. I know what Voss did to you. I know about Sarah. I'm here to help." The silence that followed Bill's words seemed to stretch for eternity, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the industrial hum of the city around them. Through the wire, he could hear Detective Walsh's team coordinating positions, their voices crackling with professional efficiency. But all of that faded into background noise as Bill focused on the steel door and the desperate family hidden behind it. Finally, the sound of multiple locks being disengaged echoed from within the warehouse. Each click and clank seemed to represent another layer of fear and desperation being peeled away. When the door finally creaked open, it revealed David Morrison's haggard face, a stark contrast to the confident businessman Bill had known just months ago. The man standing before him looked like he'd aged a decade in a matter of weeks. Morrison's usually immaculate appearance was gone, replaced by wrinkled clothes, unkempt hair, and the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept properly in months. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped the doorframe. "Bill," Morrison's voice cracked with disbelief and fear. "How did you—" "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe. If Voss's people see you—" His eyes darted nervously past Bill to scan the seemingly empty street, searching for threats that could materialize at any moment. "Let me in, David. We need to talk," Bill said gently, using the tone he reserved for calming Grace when she woke from nightmares. Morrison hesitated for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, clearly torn between hope and terror. The internal struggle was visible on his face, the desperate need for help warring with the fear of what that help might cost his family. Finally, he stepped aside with the defeated posture of a man who had run out of options. The warehouse interior was dimly lit by harsh industrial lighting that cast stark shadows across the concrete floor. The space had been hastily converted into a makeshift medical facility with equipment humming in one corner where Sarah Morrison lay on what appeared to be a hospital bed that had been moved from some legitimate medical facility. The sight hit Bill like a physical blow. This wasn't just hiding, this was a woman dying in exile. Sophie Morrison sat beside her mother in a small chair that seemed enormous around her tiny frame, coloring quietly in a book with the focused concentration children use to cope with situations too big for them to understand. Her small figure was dwarfed by the industrial space around them, and she looked up when Bill entered, her eyes wide with the particular awareness that comes to children who have seen too much sadness, too young. The medical equipment beeped and hummed with electronic persistence, creating a sterile soundtrack that seemed completely out of place in the rough warehouse environment. IV bags hung from improvised stands, and monitoring devices displayed vital signs that even Bill's untrained eye could see were concerning. "My daughter drew you," Bill said without preamble, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "She heard you on the phone in our building. She knows you're not the villain here, David. A 7-year-old could see what I was too angry to understand." Morrison's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of weeks of deception and fear had finally become too much to bear. For a moment, he looked like he might collapse under the accumulated stress of trying to save his family, while destroying his own soul in the process. "Your daughter, Grace, right?" Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember her from when I visited your office. She's about Sophie's age, isn't she? Such a bright, happy child." 7 years old. "Just like your Sophie," Bill confirmed, glancing toward the little girl who was watching their conversation with the intense focus children develop when they know adults are discussing things that will affect their world. Morrison looked toward his own daughter, and his face crumpled with emotion. Grace probably has no idea how lucky she is to live in a world where her biggest worry is what crayon to use next, where her father gets to be her hero instead of her destroyer. Sophie Morrison looked up from her coloring book, her voice small but clear in the warehouse space. "Daddy, who's the nice man?" Morrison knelt down to his daughter's level, his voice gentle despite the chaos surrounding them. "This is Mr. Matthews, sweetheart. He's here to help us." "Help with what, Daddy?" Sophie asked with the direct honesty of childhood, unaware that her simple question cut straight to the heart of everything. Morrison's composure finally shattered completely. Tears streamed down his face as he looked between his dying wife and his confused daughter, the weight of impossible choices finally overwhelming him. "Help us figure out how to make Mommy better, Princess. Help us find a way to be a family again." Sarah Morrison stirred on the bed, her voice weak but audible despite the medical equipment surrounding her. "David, what's happening? Who's here?" Morrison stood and moved to his wife's bedside, taking her frail hand in both of his with the tenderness of a man trying to hold on to something precious that was slipping away. "It's Bill Matthews, honey, the man from the company. He says he's here to help us." Sarah's eyes, though dulled by pain and medication, still held intelligence and awareness. She looked at Bill with the direct gaze of someone who had stopped worrying about social niceties in favor of harsh truths, the man whose company David stole from. "I don't understand." Bill approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, moving with the same careful patience he used when approaching frightened animals or anxious children. "I know about Nathaniel Voss, Mrs. Morrison. I know he threatened your family. I know your husband never wanted to steal from anyone." Indeed, the warehouse fell into complete silence, except for the steady beeping of Sarah's medical monitors and the distant sounds of the city beyond the walls. Bill could feel the weight of Detective Walsh's team positioned outside, waiting for his signal, while inside this makeshift medical facility, a family's entire future hung in the balance of the next few minutes. Sarah Morrison struggled to sit up in her hospital bed, her movements careful and obviously painful. Even in her weakened state, she possessed a dignity that cancer couldn't steal, a strength that made Bill understand why David Morrison was willing to sacrifice everything for her. "You know about the threats?" she asked, her voice gaining strength despite her physical frailty. "You know what they said they'd do to Sophie if David didn't comply?" Bill nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I know they threatened to hurt you both. I know they gave your husband an impossible choice. Watch his family suffer or become something he never wanted to be." Morrison's composure cracked further as he listened to Bill's words. He sank into a chair beside Sarah's bed, his head in his hands. "I tried to find another way, Bill. I mortgaged our house, sold everything we owned, even Sarah's engagement ring, the ring my grandmother gave me to propose with, but it wasn't enough. The experimental treatment, the medications she needs, the round-the-clock care, it was bankrupting us even with insurance." Sophie Morrison looked up from her coloring book, her young face showing confusion at the adult's emotional conversation. "Daddy, why are you crying? Is Mummy going to be okay?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, innocent and desperate. Morrison knelt down to his daughter's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the gentle touch of a father trying to shield his child from harsh realities. "We're going to try everything we can, Princess," Morrison said, his voice breaking. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make very hard choices to keep the people they love safe." Bill felt his phone vibrate. A text from Detective Walsh. "Teams in position, ready when you are." The words on the screen reminded him that this moment of human connection was taking place within a larger operation, but he couldn't let that overshadow the family's immediate needs. "David," Bill said carefully, "I have the police outside. But they're not here to arrest you. They're here to arrest Nathaniel Voss. We need your help to stop him from doing this to other families." Morrison looked up sharply, fear replacing exhaustion in his eyes. "If I testify against Voss, my family is dead. You don't understand what kind of man he is, what he's capable of. He doesn't make empty threats." "Not if Voss is behind bars where he belongs," Bill replied, "and not if we make sure Sarah gets the treatment she needs, regardless of what happens with the legal proceedings." Bill pulled out his phone and showed Morrison a bank transfer authorization he'd prepared that morning. The screen displayed an amount that made Morrison's eyes widen in disbelief. $5 million, ready to be transferred to an account dedicated solely to Sarah's medical care. "I'm moving this money into a medical trust for Sarah's treatment," Bill explained. "Whatever she needs, for as long as she needs it. The best doctors, the most advanced treatments, experimental therapies that aren't even available yet. Everything." Sarah Morrison stared at the phone screen, her eyes filling with tears. "Bill, we can't accept this, after what David did to your company, to your employees. Your husband did what any father would do when faced with his family's destruction," Bill interrupted gently. "Now let me do what any father should do when he has the power to help." He knelt down beside Sophie, who was watching the adults with wide, worried eyes. "Sophie, would you like to meet my daughter Grace? She's exactly your age, and she loves to draw just like you do." Sophie looked to her father, who nodded through his tears, unable to speak. The gesture was small, but it represented hope, the possibility that his daughter might have a future where she could be a normal child again, where she could have friends and playdates and worries no bigger than choosing the right crayon color. "When your mommy gets better," Bill continued, his voice gentle but firm with conviction, "maybe you two can have a playdate. Grace has a huge playroom with more toys than any one child needs." "When mommy gets better?" Sophie asked hopefully, her young voice carrying all the desperate optimism of childhood. Bill looked at Morrison, then at Sarah, then back at the little girl whose innocence reminded him so much of Grace. In that moment, he made a promise that would cost him millions, but might save a family's soul. "Yes, sweetheart, when your mommy gets better." Morrison stood slowly, his decision made. "What do you need me to do?" The question hung in the warehouse air like a turning point in history. Bill felt the weight of the moment, a desperate father's surrender, a family's last hope, and the beginning of justice for crimes that had torn multiple lives apart. Through his wire, he could hear Detective Walsh's sharp intake of breath, knowing that Morrison's cooperation would make their case against Voss airtight. "First, we need you to tell us everything about Voss's operation," Bill said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in crucial business negotiations. "Every detail, every contact, every threat. The police need evidence that will put him away for decades." Morrison nodded, his shoulders straightening, with the relief of finally being able to tell the truth after months of deception. "Voss doesn't just target individuals. He runs a network. He finds people with desperate circumstances and forces them to commit crimes they'd never consider otherwise. Desperate parents, people facing bankruptcy, anyone vulnerable enough to be controlled." Sarah Morrison struggled to sit up further, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He knew everything about our situation before he ever approached David. Our medical bills, our insurance denials, Sophie's school schedule, even my treatment times. He had done research like we were a business acquisition." "How many others?" Bill asked, though he suspected the answer would be disturbing. "At least a dozen that I know of," Morrison replied. "An accountant forced to embezzle from a charity, a pharmacist stealing medications, a bank manager approving fraudulent loans. All of them parents of young children, all facing circumstances that made them vulnerable to his threats." Detective Walsh's voice crackled through Bill's earpiece. We need locations, names, evidence. This could be the breakthrough we've needed to dismantle his entire operation." Bill repeated the request, and Morrison began providing details with the precision of someone who had been forced to memorize every aspect of his criminal involvement. Names, addresses, account numbers, meeting locations, a complete map of Voss's criminal empire spilled from Morrison's lips like water from a broken dam. Sophie Morrison had stopped coloring and was listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention children develop when they sense their world is about to change dramatically. "Daddy, are the bad men going to go away?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. Morrison knelt beside his daughter, taking her small hands in his. "Yes, Princess, the bad men are going to go away, and we're going to make sure they can't hurt any other families." "And Mommy will get better?" Morrison looked at Bill, who nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Matthews is going to help make sure Mommy gets the best doctors in the world. Better doctors than we ever imagined possible." Sarah Morrison's monitoring equipment began beeping more rapidly, and Morrison immediately moved to her side. Her breathing had become labored, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of a body pushed beyond its limits. "David," she whispered, "I need you to promise me something. If this treatment doesn't work, if I don't make it through this, I need you to make sure Sophie remembers that we tried to do the right thing in the end." "And don't talk like that," Morrison said, his voice breaking. "You're going to get better. Bill's doctors are going to save you." "Promise me," Sarah insisted, with the fierce determination of a mother ensuring her child's future. Morrison looked at his wife, then at his daughter, then at Bill. "I promise. But you're going to be here to remind her yourself." Through his earpiece, Bill heard Detective Walsh's urgent voice. "Voss's car just pulled up outside. We need to move now." Bill's blood ran cold. "David, Voss is here. We need to get your family to safety immediately." Morrison's face went white with terror. "He said he'd kill them if I ever talked to the police, if he sees you here." "The police are surrounding the building," Bill assured him, "but we need to get Sarah and Sophie to a secure location right now." The sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside the warehouse, followed by footsteps and muffled voices. Sophie Morrison looked around with growing fear, sensing the adult's panic without understanding its source. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered. Morrison scooped up his daughter while Bill moved to help disconnect Sarah's medical equipment. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. We're going to go somewhere safe now." Detective Walsh's voice came through the earpiece. "Back exit now. We have a medical team standing by." As they prepared to move Sarah, she grabbed Bill's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing David as a father instead of a criminal." Bill squeezed her hand gently. "Every parent deserves a chance to save their child." The next several hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of justice and medical intervention. While Detective Walsh's team surrounded Nathaniel Voss and his associates outside the warehouse, Bill found himself in the surreal position of riding in an ambulance with the Morrison family, watching as Sarah was transferred to Northwestern Memorial Hospital's intensive care unit. The contrast between the chaotic warehouse and the pristine medical facility was striking. Here, in rooms filled with state-of-the-art equipment and staffed by some of the country's leading oncologists, Sarah Morrison finally had access to the care that could save her life. Bill had made a single phone call, and suddenly doors that had been closed due to insurance denials and financial limitations swung wide open. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the hospital's chief of oncology, met them at the emergency entrance with a team of specialists who had been briefed on Sarah's case during the ambulance ride. "Mrs. Morrison, we're going to take excellent care of you," she said, with the confidence of someone accustomed to fighting impossible battles and winning. In the family waiting area, Sophie Morrison sat between her father and Bill, her colouring book spread across her lap, but forgotten as she watched the medical team work. The little girl's resilience amazed Bill. Despite everything she'd witnessed, she maintained the fundamental optimism that seemed to be built into childhood's DNA. "Mr. Matthews," she said quietly, tugging on his sleeve, "is my mommy really going to get better now?" Bill looked at David Morrison, who was staring at the intensive care unit doors with the expression of a man afraid to hope. "The doctors here are the best in the world, sweetheart. They're going to do everything possible to help your mommy." Morrison's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Walsh. "Voss in custody. Found evidence of 12 other families being extorted. Your testimony will put him away for life." Relief washed over Morrison's face like sunrise after the longest night. "They got him," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "They actually got him." "And the other families?" Bill asked. "Free," Morrison replied, reading further into the message. "Voss's entire operation has been dismantled. No more parents will be forced to choose between their children's safety and their moral code." Dr. Chen emerged from the intensive care unit 3 hours later, her scrubs replaced by a clean white coat, her expression cautiously optimistic. "We've begun the immunotherapy protocol," she announced to the small group. "Sarah's responding exceptionally well to the treatment. Her latest scans show significant reduction in lymph node involvement, and her blood markers are trending in exactly the direction we hoped." "What does that mean?" Sophie asked, her 7-year-old directness cutting through medical euphemisms. Dr. Chen knelt down to Sophie's eye level, her voice gentle but honest. "It means your mommy's body is fighting the sickness really well with our help. The treatment will take about a year, but lymphoma like your mommy's has a very good chance of going away completely." Sophie Morrison burst into tears, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief so profound they seemed to come from her soul. Morrison swept his daughter into his arms, holding her as if he could absorb all her fear and pain into himself. "Daddy, can I tell Mommy?" Sophie asked between sobs. "Yes, Princess. In a little while, when the doctors say it's okay, you can tell Mommy everything's going to be fine." Bill's phone rang. Grace calling from home. "Daddy misses. Henderson says you're helping the scared man. Is he not scared anymore?" Bill looked at Morrison, who was holding his daughter while tears of hope streamed down his face. "No, sweetheart, he's not scared anymore. And his little girl isn't scared anymore either. Can she come play with my dolls now?" Bill smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Very soon, Grace, very soon." As evening fell over Chicago, Bill stood at the hospital window overlooking the city lights. Somewhere out there, Nathaniel Voss sat in a jail cell. His criminal empire collapsed. 12 families were free from extortion and fear. A dying woman was receiving treatment that could save her life, and 2 7-year-old girls would soon meet for a playdate that represented far more than childhood friendship. It represented the triumph of compassion over revenge, of hope over despair. Morrison approached the window, joining Bill in looking out over the city that had nearly destroyed them both. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You don't need to thank me," Bill replied. "You need to focus on being the father Sophie needs and the husband Sarah deserves. The rest will take care of itself." "What about your company? The money I stole?" Bill turned to face Morrison directly. "The FBI recovered about 60% from Voss's domestic accounts. The offshore funds are still tied up in legal proceedings, but we expect to recover most of it eventually. As for the immediate shortfall, Matthews Corporation weathered it better than expected. Our stock actually rose when the full story came out." Morrison nodded, understanding that some debts couldn't be measured in dollars. "I want to work for you when this is all over. However you'll have me, construction, maintenance, anything. I want to spend the rest of my career helping you rebuild what I helped destroy. Bill considered this for a moment. I might have a better idea. Matthews Corporation needs someone who understands what it means to protect families from predators like Voss, interested in heading up our new corporate ethics division. 18 months later, on a brilliant spring morning that made Chicago's harsh winter seem like a distant memory, Bill Matthews stood in his office watching two 8-year-old girls play in the company's newly constructed playground. Grace and Sophie Morrison chased each other around the colorful equipment with the pure joy of children who had found their best friend in the world. The playground had been Sophie's idea, suggested during one of her many visits to Matthews Corporation while her mother received treatment. Daddy's work should have a place for kids to play, she had announced, with the certainty that only children possess about how the world should operate. Bill had made it happen within a month, creating a space where employees could bring their children and where the sound of laughter could compete with the sound of business. Sarah Morrison sat on a nearby bench, her hair fully restored to its natural auburn waves, her cheeks glowing with the health of someone whose body had won a difficult battle. The immunotherapy had exceeded all expectations. Her latest scans showed complete remission, and her oncologist spoke confidently about her long-term prognosis. She looked like a woman who had been given her life back, which was exactly what she was. Grace wants to know if Sophie can sleep over this weekend, Sarah called out to Bill. Something about showing her the movie room and the secret passage behind the bookshelf. Bill laughed, remembering his own childhood fascination with hidden passages and secret rooms. As long as you're feeling up to it, I know Grace has been planning this sleepover for weeks. David Morrison emerged from the building carrying architectural plans for Matthews Corporation's latest project, a series of affordable housing developments designed with sustainable technology and family-friendly amenities. His title of Director of Corporate Ethics and Family Services was unique in the business world, but it perfectly suited a man who had learned the hard way what happened when families weren't protected from corporate predators. The Henderson project is approved, Morrison announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose work had genuine meaning. 200 units of affordable housing with on-site childcare and medical clinics. Families will never have to choose between paying rent and taking care of their children's health. It was Morrison's brainchild, inspired by his own experience of nearly losing everything due to medical costs. Matthews Corporation's new housing developments included comprehensive support systems designed to prevent the kind of desperation that had made Morrison vulnerable to Voss's threats. And the Voss trial? Bill asked, though he already knew the answer from the morning news. Plea agreement accepted last month, Morrison replied with grim satisfaction. 22 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for 15 years. His lawyers knew the evidence was overwhelming, 12 families testifying, financial records, recorded conversations. Rather than risk life in prison at trial, he took the deal. Sarah Morrison joined the conversation, moving with the easy grace of someone whose body was healing from the inside out. The other families want to do something special to thank you, Bill. They're planning some kind of ceremony. They don't need to thank me, Bill said, watching Grace and Sophie build an elaborate sand castle in the playground's sandbox. Seeing their children play without fear is thanks enough. You saved more than just our families, Morrison insisted. You saved our faith in humanity. When Sophie grows up, she'll remember that when her family needed help, strangers became friends. That's a lesson worth more than any amount of money. Margaret approached from the building, carrying a folder that Bill recognized as the quarterly financial reports. Sir, the board meeting is in an hour. They'll want to discuss the company's recovery and the new ethical initiatives. Bill nodded, but his attention remained on the playground. Matthews Corporation had not only survived the financial crisis, but had emerged stronger than ever. The story of how a CEO had chosen compassion over revenge had inspired customers, employees, and investors alike. The company's stock had reached record highs, and they'd received more development contracts than they could handle. "Tell the board they can see our most important metric right there," Bill said, pointing toward the playground. Two little girls who are best friends instead of victims. A family that's whole instead of broken. A company that remembers what really matters. Grace ran over to the adults, her face flushed with excitement and her clothes covered in sandbox sand. "Daddy, Sophie says when we grow up, we're going to work together and help other kids whose mommies and daddies are scared. Is that a good job?" Bill knelt down to his daughter's level, brushing sand from her hair with the gentle touch of a father who had learned that the most important business in the world was taking care of the people you love. "That's the best job in the world, sweetheart. Better than any job Daddy's ever had." Sophie Morrison joined them, slipping her small hand into Grace's with the natural affection of true friendship. "My daddy says your daddy is a hero because he helped us when the bad man was being mean. Are you a hero too, Mr. Matthews?" Bill looked around at the scene surrounding him. Sarah Morrison, healthy and laughing. David Morrison, building a career based on protecting families. Grace and Sophie planning a future of helping others. Employees bringing their children to a workplace that valued families as much as profits. "No, sweetheart," he said finally. "I'm just a daddy who learned that sometimes the best way to fix what's broken in your own life is to help fix what's broken in someone else's." As the two girls ran back to their playground adventures, Bill Matthews stood in the Chicago sunshine and realized that Grace's simple drawing had done more than solve a fraud case. It had reminded him that the most important success wasn't measured in dollars or market share, but in the laughter of children who felt safe in the world their parents had built for them. The circle was complete. Justice had been served, families had been healed, and two 7-year-old girls had found the kind of friendship that would last a lifetime. Sometimes, Bill thought as he watched them play, the most important business meetings happened on playgrounds, and the most valuable contracts were written in crayon.